I wanted to first of all say something about why I wrote the book. And I wrote it after and began the book in 2006 when I'd just come back from the Congo. And during that visit to the Congo, I'd experienced visions and, not visions, but visual impact on my retina that I never hoped to see ever again in my life. I just saw the sinister level of violence against women in a very war-torn society. And for me, it crystallized both in Goma, which is the bit between the North and South Kivu provinces, where Heal Africa does an amazing job on war-torn victims, but particularly, increasingly, on rape victims, right down to a place called Baraka, which is desperately poor at the bottom of the Great Lakes. And all the way down, I just saw so much violence against women, so much in terms of war and the way in which women were atrocitized, really. And so I asked to speak to the chief of police and the head of military justice in Baraka, because I was there as president of Tear Fund, and we were funding a lot of HIV/AIDS initiatives and education for their soldiers and their policemen. And they were delighted to entertain me and to produce food and have lots of jocular encounters. And I've been praying a lot about this, that there will be an opportunity to raise the whole issue of military violence against women. So I took the opportunity. In the middle of a short pause, I said there was a question I was interested in asking, and that was whether they saw any link between HIV/AIDS spreading in this area and the level of violence against women. And the whole atmosphere changed. They became immediately hostile towards me, whereas it had all been very jocular and happy before. They assured me there was no violence against women. I was a rich white woman, and I'd been taken in by these women. Please don't give them money. They're not violated. It's a myth. So then I had to say, but look, I'm a woman as well. I've got a woman's body. I actually know about violence. I've seen rape. And if you don't believe your women, then you'll have to believe me. And eventually, after a very, very long conversation, they admitted that there was violence against women, but it was marginal, and the women were asking for it and a whole range of other things. And so then I said, okay, now we do agree that there is violence from soldiers on women. My question is, what's happened since then? How many courts have been set up? What are the sentences that these soldiers get? What happens to the women? Is there any reparation? And of course, the answers were very, very bleak. No courts, no justice, no criminal encounters, no punishment, because it simply did not exist. It wasn't on the statute book. There were no laws. And it was the experience of that that made me start to write, because this had to change. We have to change things. And in fact, there are laws now in the Congo, and they've been brought about largely through a group of wonderful Christians in Heal Africa, in Goma, who have really gone for advocacy in a big way. But what had happened to me during that time was that I started to join up all the dots in violence against women, because many years before that I'd been involved in incest survival with people, and in counseling capacities, in intimate partner violence and so on. And suddenly I saw it as a global thing. Many, many different forms of violence against women in many, many different societies. And the book got bigger and bigger as I started to write, because originally it was just about rape and domestic violence, and then about rape as a weapon of war, and then about, suddenly I had to put child brides in because there's an awful lot of violence there. And what about selective abortion? And then, of course, there's FGM, and suddenly there's trafficking and prostitution. And it just really, really took off in an amazingly large way. So I'm going to romp you through some of the things that have concerned me and why I feel that this is an absolutely central issue for Christians, and share this with you as fast as I can in the short time that's left to me. So I think that if you look at the life cycle of a global woman, it's a myth. I know there isn't such a thing as a global woman with a life cycle, but this is my way into the book. If you look at that life cycle, you'll find that even before the woman is born, there's violence already starting. And I want to, in the book, I actually, for the first 9 chapters, takes you through this life cycle in different societies and different cultures, and unpacks stories and tells atrocities and so on. But also uses very, very much the work of researchers in these areas, people who've given their lives to trying to eradicate some of these things. Some of these are Christians, and some of them are not. And I really kind of want to pay homage to those people who are not Christians, but who know that this is so important that it has to stop, and people who've often been martyred for the sake of standing up for the truth in these areas. And I want to just choose the first 3 chapters as illustration of the rest of the book, because we'll be here all day. And the big question I was really struggling with all the way through is why? Why? Why is there this violence against women? Why does it take these societal forms? Why is it always women? And it's not true, of course, that it's always women. I mean, there's violence against men. In fact, there's more violence against men than against women. But that violence is largely between gangs. It's in the armed forces. It's in those kinds of areas where it's structured violence. But this random kind of violence is usually against women and is disproportionate in terms of the human race. And I kept coming across endless sorts of answers to the question, why? And so the book is really trying to ask the question of why? Why is there selective abortion? Why is there female genital mutilation? Why is there domestic abuse? Why is there intimate partner violence take the shape it does? And what I kept coming across were answers given both in the academic press, in books, in research projects, in PhDs, but also in humour, in popular literature, and in people's psyche that were along these kinds of lines. There were cultural answers, loads and loads of cultural answers, economic answers. It's because of poverty. It's because people need to live, and therefore women become a commodity. It was social answers. Well, these have been the patterns. This is what it's always like in our society. Biological answers. I spend a whole chapter looking at evolutionary psychology and biological reductionism because I think it is such rubbish. I couldn't really wait to get my teeth into it and give it a good savaging because I think it's done so much harm to the way we think about men and women. It really has. The genetic answers, Richard Dawkins massively uses the whole idea of the gene, and I'll be looking at that right at the end. Psychological answers, well, it's the way our psychology is. Men actually are kind of muscular, and we've got all these hormones and so on. Testosterone means that they have to lay into women every now and again just to kind of keep sane. Loads of psychology, which again is marginally rubbish. Historical answers, well, this is just part of history. These were reflective of patterns in the past. Legal answers, because there's not enough laws protecting the vulnerable, because these laws are not implemented. Philosophical answers, we all sit around and have a long philosophical chinwag about the nature of violence and whether this is violence at all or whether it's just a mythical. I haven't got time for those either, even though I'm a philosopher. But theological answers, what does a Christian say? What answers do we give to the whole issue of violence against women? And I want to start with the first one on that thing going round, and that is selective abortion, and which is rampant, really, in much of India. And, of course, it was there in China before they changed the one-child policy for families. In almost every poor area of India, as well as affluent areas of India, you'll find abortion clinics which are taking away the life of the girl fetus. And Sabu George, whom I respect enormously, is a fabulous researcher in this area, has lots and lots of work. He's arguing that India kills 10 million girls in 20 years. And of course, the impact of this massive gap in the population, this male-heavy population of India, is going to have impact, isn't it? And it has an impact on all other forms of gender-based violence because suddenly there are not enough brides. A lot of these men are not going to get married. So how do you plug the gap? Well, then you traffic women in as wives, as spare wives, so that they can marry. And there's a lot more rape. Delhi is often referred to as the biggest capital in the world, absolutely swallowing in rape. And a lot of these other areas. Why? And I'm just looking at some of the answers that we get, which are really all very true. All these answers are true. So cultural and economic answers are because of the dowry. The dowry is built deeply into Indian society. Effectively what it says is if you want a bridegroom for your daughter, you have to pay the bridegroom's family. And the better off the bridegroom is, the more educated the bridegroom is, the more it will cost you. And of course, if you've got one daughter, well, then that's going to be quite an expense. If you've got 2 daughters, boy, you're going to watch the pennies. If you've got 3 daughters, you may well be in debt for the rest of your life. Especially as, of course, increasing materialism and affluence is there in India. And it's no longer just a bit of jewelry, it's actually yachts, expensive holidays abroad, and the bride's family is going to be in enormous debt. And what's more, the bride may well lose her life if the family at some stage can't continue to pay the dowry, if it's an ongoing payment scheme. There's been lots and lots of homicides taking the punishment on the bride because the family doesn't pay up. So those are the economic and the cultural answers. But of course, underneath that, there's another set of answers, which are kind of moral answers. I mean, you couldn't do this in a society unless you had a very low view of the fetus. That the fetus isn't really quite human. It's going to be human when it's born. It's going to be a girl, but actually it's disposable, highly disposable. So already you've got an ethical dimension to that discussion. And there are legal answers as to why. Because the failure to implement laws. There's no regulation. Anybody can have a scanning machine. Anybody can operate a scanning machine. And Sabu George and a lot of people like him have been pleading for changes in the law so that these things are regulated and stopped. And you don't have untrained people getting money in order to abort babies. But ultimately, of course, there's a Christian answer, and that is to do with how we see human beings. Who are we? What is it to be a human being? What is it to be a female human being? What is it to be a vulnerable female fetus? And the answers to that, of course, are very, very sinister in the whole area. Some of the economic answers come out like this. This is a poster I picked up. Spend 500 rupees now, but save 50,000 rupees later. Just have an abortion now, and then you will not be wasting money on this girl for the rest of her life. And it's got so bad that the government puts up posters that you'll see all over India. And here's two girls whose eyes are caught. Save girl, save family. Girls bring happiness at home. When I showed that to one of my Indian friends, she was absolutely livid. Really, really angry. She said, yes, that's what the government does. It puts up posters. It doesn't implement the laws. The laws just kind of carry on. Nobody actually bothers and nobody's policing it. They just put up posters. And her derision for the whole legal and political structure was unmistakable. What answers there are very important ones. And all of those answers are true. But the underlying Christian answer is we've got to value human beings. We've got to have a biblical view of our humanness. And if we violate that, then there's no chance for us. In all kinds of ways, people are going to be hurt. Looking at the next one, and I only want to do 3 of these, as I've already said. Female genital mutilation. I'm sure that how many people know a lot about FGM these days? Put your hands up if you know quite a bit about FGM. Put your hands up if you know nothing at all about FGM. That is interesting, because 10 years ago, most people would have put your hands up at the end. But it's because the issues have been aired quite thoroughly in our period of the last decade. And a report, when I was writing this book, we had to stop the printing, which is very embarrassing for me because David had just fished out a whole new set of statistics that contradicted the statistics in the book. But because they made my case much stronger than the case, we stopped it and we actually incorporated them. And this report suggested that around 140,000 women in England and Wales are actually living with the consequences of FGM in our own country. There were women struggling with this. And I spend a lot of time in my book listening to their stories. What's it like to be somebody who's undergone FGM? What's it like when you go to a well woman's clinic? What's it like when you have a scan or have a smear test? And some of them are telling their stories and they're horrendous. And of course, it's been enormously helped. My case has been helped by a woman called Hebo Wadery, who's just written her own account called Cut. And it's just an account of what it's like to be an African woman in the United Kingdom living with the consequences of FGM. And she can be much more graphic than I can because I'm an outsider on this. And I don't want to upset people. She doesn't care. She says, this is how it says, this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like. Listen to me, please. Why aren't you standing alongside me and eradicating this horrendous process? Why are British people just stepping aside and letting it continue, even in the UK? Why is nobody being prosecuted? Why isn't this seen as a key safeguarding issue amongst the children and adolescents? And her questions are very important ones. So what is FGM? Very quickly, 3 main forms, and I suppose you know about them. Clitoridectomy involves the removal of the hood and part of the clitoris. So it's a savage operation. It's digging away your genitalia and actually cutting it off. But the next one, excision, nearly almost all of the clitoris and the adjacent labia are taken away surgically. But the worst kind, of course, for 15% of all FGM is of this kind, is infibulation. Extensive cutting and stitching, removing the tissue in the genital area. And it can be done at any stage. It can be done in very small infants, little girls. It can be done prepubescent girls. It can be done in puberty or just after puberty, and hardly ever with very sterile instruments. And it's not surprising that the after effect, and in fact the effect of the process itself, is horrendous. So what happens straight away? Nearly always, there's some kind of infection, there's excessive bleeding, septic shock, difficulty in passing urine, and so on. But later on, there's going to be scarring, excruciating intercourse, kidney impairment, infertility, fistulas, massive number of fistulas. Many girls are actually, they die during the process itself because it is a horrendous process. But with the most invasive process, girls are stitched up. And then Hebo's book, Cut, gives you the diagrams of how they're stitched up. Because now most of the genitalia have been cut away, your insides fall out, of course. So you have to be stitched very carefully, leaving the tiniest hole for urine and for menstrual blood to flow through. Why are they stitched up so carefully? To make sure that they stay virgins. When are they opened? On their wedding night. Who opens them? The bridegroom. Can you imagine a wedding night where if you're a man, you've got to open your wife, you've got to cut your wife open in order to have sex with her? And again, in writing the book, I read lots and lots and lots of reports. I listened to the women who told me what it was like on their wedding night. I followed their stories through how it was the worst night of their life. It had been built up to being such a wonderful night, but they ended up in hospital, nearly always. And then the whole aftermath in terms of living with it, living with the consequences. What are we doing about it? Why does it take place? Why is it what's going on? The whys, again, are so very important. And there's the same answers that we've already been looking at. Well, it's culture. It's a rite of passage. It's surrounded by cultural myths. I was told in Ethiopia when I visited a community where every woman had had female genital mutilation, that if they hadn't been they call it circumcision, they hadn't been circumcised, their clitoris would grow twice the length of a penis and would be dangling between their legs. And I said, that simply isn't the case. It doesn't happen. And other than taking my clothes off and demonstrating, which I wasn't prepared to do, there was no way of actually convincing them of this because they had never seen a woman who hadn't gone through this invasive process. Cultural myths, it's a rite of passage. It's the entrance into womanhood and those kinds of things. But there's also psychological reasons why. There's a taboo on women enjoying sex. And if you take away all the enjoyment, the pleasurable zones in the genitalia, then they won't enjoy sex, so it says. And taking those away means also you're controlling female sexuality. Patriarchal answers as to why. The woman belongs to the man. And this is a way of showing that the woman belongs to the man. Even in the United Kingdom, a Somalian girl who is entering marriage, the bridegroom's family may still ask to examine her body to make sure she hasn't been uncut yet, to make sure that she hasn't had sex with anybody else. I mean, the humiliation of all of that, but the right, the entitlement of the family and the men over the girl's body is really quite deep. And then the failure to have gender equality legislation, complete failure to recognize the very epitome of the legal thing. But again, the real why is because it's about a distortion of our humanness. It's saying something about our gendered humanness that simply is not true. It's not true biblically, it's not true in terms of God's relationship with them, who we are, what our identity is, and who we are as persons. I want to just choose one more area, and that's the third chapter, well, it's actually the fourth chapter in the book, of child brides. Because again, because this is the day of the child and the girl child, I wanted to focus on these earlier sections today. Every 3 seconds, a girl under the age of 18 is married somewhere across the world, nearly always without her consent, and usually to a very much older man who may also have several other wives. Very often she's seen as a guarantee against HIV/AIDS, which of course again is one of the many cultural myths. United Nations Population Fund suggests that every day between 30,000 and 40,000 girls are married too young. And you can see pictures, they're all over the place. There's a wonderful exhibition in Geneva a year and a half ago where you see the disproportionate ages of the girls and the men, their bridegrooms. And of course what happens to these wee lasses is that they become pregnant at a very young age. They have no right to negotiate sex, they don't know anything about safe sex, and childhood and maternity become very confused together in the whole area. But the impact of this is not just superficial. In fact, there are huge health risks to the girl. Health risks in terms of risks in pregnancy. She will be pregnant when she's got an immature body. Her pelvis isn't big enough. Her internal structure is not big enough, not mature enough to actually maintain a strong pregnancy. But also risks to the babies they bear. There's a very high level of infant mortality amongst these babies, and the ones who are born alive may not be actually capable of sustaining their life for very long and may struggle with disability for the whole of their lives. But there are social impacts too. Loss of childhood. They're whisked out of school as soon as it's known that they're going to be married off, and that will be the last education they have. And they've got to get on with older wives, and that will be their learning process. Financial dependency on the man, very, very limited future prospects. She'll never have a chance of building up any economic foundation in order to actually have any sort of independent life. And then high risks for violence. And in the book, I'm not going to read it to you, you can have to read it for yourself, go through a series of horrendous scenarios of sometimes very small girls who are simply raped and raped and raped by their husbands because, again, there's that entitlement. The husband owns the child, and the child is there to fulfill his own satisfaction. And the photographs in the Geneva exhibition on the girls who've been violated and whose mouths, the hand of the bridegroom over their mouths, muffled their screams and so on, are really tragic, horrible photographs. And their stories are tragic too, the way in which they lose everything and become brides. So these are some of the things. Why? Well, again, it's the way girlhood is defined, and that's a cultural thing. Different cultures define girlhood in such a way that they are defined differently from boys, and this is true even in our own culture. Just think of the different aspects we give to boy children and girl children, and why. Ask the question why. A lot of the brides are because of poverty, because you're buying your way out of poverty, especially in some cultures where they marry you off to a man who can afford to keep you. But again, it's about male control, attitudes to childhood, and a very low respect of children. Whereas the Bible, again, if you read the Gospels, Jesus elevates children. He takes a child, he puts it right in the midst of us and says anybody who doesn't trust in the way this child is, is not mature. And it's better that somebody who violates children, it's better for a millstone, a great heavy stone be put around their neck and them thrown into the lake. I mean, imagine that. So when we look at a theology of childhood from the scriptures, we see a very different theology from what we see in this practice of child brides. The rest of my book really is going through all of these other aspects, and I'm just going to do it in pictures, just to give you the feeling rather than anything else. This was honor killings. That was the last chapter that went in. I just felt in the end, with so many honor killings going on, stonings and mutilations, because they disapproved of the social mores. They stood outside the social mores. Quite common to bury a woman up to her neck and then stone her to death. And the way that communities themselves are standing against this. But of course it happens also in the United Kingdom. You remember Shafilia Ahmed, and the most recent case just a month ago of this girl who went back to see her family in Pakistan and never came home. Why? Again, we have to ask the same questions, all of them. Or intimate partner violence, something very close to home. And it might be horrendous in other cultures, and everywhere people are really protesting about the right of the husband in a relationship. These are acid attacks that occur every day in many areas of the country. the WHO says that more than 50% of Bangladeshi women are subject to domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And 3,000 acid-base attacks are reported between those years. 603 million women live in countries where there's no such thing as domestic violence. Again, it's like rape. It's not on the statute book, doesn't exist. But of course, it's also in the UK. It's a massive issue in the UK. And since I started giving these stories and going around, I've got lots of women's aid centres, people come from refuge and so on, and just sharing their stories. That's been quite interesting for me, because they've said 10 years ago you would never got a Christian being involved in this. Christians just didn't want to know about it. We were somewhere else. And in a sense, they're quite gratified that it's become our issue too. The crime survey figures in 2015 estimated that 1.4 million women in the UK suffer domestic violence, actually England and Wales actually, and that 1 in 4 will suffer it in their lifetime. How many people have been listening to the Archers? Very interesting. That script has been advised by the Women's Refuge and Women's Aid Centres, and it's spot on, the whole area of how you actually undermine, drip away by war of attrition against somebody who is now in your power. And it's often only when the children are at risk, as it was, of course, with Helen Archer, that you finally leave the marriage and get out. And that's the most dangerous part. Most homicides in the United Kingdom, attacks and murders of women, are actually in the place when she is escaping from a violent marriage. And the figures are really quite high. There's a woman called Karen Ngala Smith, who all she does is collect the names of dead women. And she has a web page called Counting Dead Women. And she's really got it in her system. She is no friend of Christianity. She thinks that we're sloppy, we're mythical, we're weird, and we ought to be doing a lot more than we are doing. I've been in correspondence with her for a while. And these are the pictures of women who were killed in January and February this year. And what she's doing is commemorating women who have got no commemoration. Somebody's killed them, murdered them, for no other reason than they were able to do. And this is her point. Why? Well, again, we've got all of these reasons: psychological reasons, legal reasons, political reasons, ethical reasons, biological reasons. It's inevitable, it's genes, and of course our own theological reasons. And it's similarly, if we went to go through trafficking, look at who's trafficked, what the composition is. Predominantly, it's females, it's women and girls. Men and boys trafficked for labor, but women and girls predominantly for sex. And the girl prostitution, tiny child prostitution, trafficked for sex, again, is a massive issue. This is Beyond the Streets in Ipswich, wonderful organisation that is working alongside sex workers and drawing our attention as Christians, Christian organisation, that we didn't need to be done this. Why again and again? The same list of answers. And the final two are about rape. Rape culture is massively spreading in the UK. I'm going around different universities and I'm hearing just how bad it is over the last decade. And these are university protests. This is Leeds. It's very interesting. I showed this picture at York and somebody got very, very excited. You see the lad behind the poster, the tall boy with the dark hair. Somebody jumped up and said, "Look, that's my cousin," she said. I've been banging on about this for ages and he's been ignoring me, and now he's actually in this protest march. So she thought this was a great victory for her. But it's happening. I mean, there's more issues about rape on our university campuses than almost any other issue in gender area. I've been asked to speak to so many campuses over the last few months, really, on the whole issue. Rape culture, I haven't got time to talk about it, but it's there in the book. What is rape culture? Why is it that suddenly you can actually have music halls and joke, humour all over the country, people standing up in public and cracking rape jokes, which aren't even remotely funny, without prosecution, without fear of punishment? And why is it that there's still such a stigma to being raped rather than to being a rapist? And all the whys, again, the answers that we need to look at. And then finally, the thing that drove me to write the book in the first place, rape as a weapon of war. This was the hospital at Goma that I visited when I visited it. It had a canvas ward for people who were having fistula operations as a result of being raped. And they were recovering from those operations to a bed. It was such an intense area. And outside, the United Nations were protecting it. And elsewhere, women were marching with their soldiers in order to escape the atrocities of the militia who were coming to burn their villages and kill their menfolk. And this woman, whose face is being covered by a hand, had the choice of either marching with her soldiers or staying home and waiting for the militia to come back and kill her. They killed her husband and her sons. And so she chose the former. And of course, the price was she becomes a sexual property of the soldiers. They will rape her because that's their entitlement for her protection. Why? Why? So the last section of the book is just given to answering questions, the question why. And I deal with the biological evolutionary question, the whole idea that it's deep in our genes, that we're really sophisticated animals. The male animal is a predatory animal that uses violence in order to actually get the meat, get the mate, and live the life. And therefore, why would we expect anything different from the human race? Men are predatory animals who actually need to further their genetic material, their own genetic structure, with as many females as possible. And they do this by raping and all the rest of it. And these are some of the so-called scholars. And these people are getting Nobel Prizes for this kind of thing. Well, not Nobel Prizes, but other kinds of academic prizes. The human male, faced with the choice between force or genetic extinction, will obviously go for force, obviously. Biological speaking, there's no reason to restrict his mating to receptive, consenting females. The non-receptive women can get pregnant, so their protests are, genetically speaking, irrelevant. You see the point? You've just got to go out and rape them. It doesn't matter if they don't want it, as long as you're furthering your genetic material, your genetic potential, as long as you are actually, your seed is continuing in the next generation of offspring. That's the right thing to be doing. That's what it is in the male psyche. And similarly, the whole idea that we have human responsibility and are in charge of our actions and we have some choice, Dawkins really dismisses this very quickly. Doesn't a truly scientific, and I want you to eliminate that word scientific because it's so grossly misused here, doesn't a truly mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense of the very idea of responsibility, whether diminished or not? Any crime, however heinous, is in principle to be blamed on antecedent conditions, acting through the accused's physiology, hereditary, and environment. Constructs, like blame and responsibility, indeed, evil or good, are built into our brains by millennia of Darwinian evolution. They're not real. They don't exist. There's no such thing. There's no choice, no human responsibility, no good, no bad. It's all genes. It's all the furtherance of our genetic material. Why? And then there's a whole set of arguments that simply blame culture and usually religion. It's all because of these religious edifices. It's all because of Islam. It's all because of Christianity. It's all because of St. Paul. It's all because of. And these answers proliferate. And actually, I've heard them all as I've been going around. This is mainly daily. Patriarchy is the prevailing religion of the entire planet. And she's scornful of Christians. She's dead now, but she left the Catholic Church because she was so scornful of the way Christians treated women and gender attitudes amongst Christians. And she says something like this: you think you're different, we think we're different, but actually we're no different from any other religion. We're all male dominant, male predominant, and we all have a very low view of women that leaves them open to this kind of abuse. Patriarchy. The system of male dominance. And another woman, well-known scholar, whose name I've forgotten, she's so well-known, wherever religion is, patriarchs rule, women's lives are in danger. Now, this is heavy stuff. I want to just finish the thing by looking at my own response, and this is why I was driven to write the book, and this is why I was desperate to write it as a Christian, because I think it's human beings who are to blame. I don't think it's patriarchy, I don't think it's biology, I don't think it's systems, I don't think it's culture, I think it's us. And it's about time human beings took responsibility for the choices they make and the way they choose to live. And the abuse of power, the exploiting of the vulnerable, the turning people into things, commodifying women particularly, is all what we do. We do it deliberately. We do it in cultures, we do it in societies, we do it in our homes, we do it, and we have to bear the responsibility. And there's a simple word that the Christian understanding of human beings has that actually does begin to explain it and lays the foundation. And I'm arguing that unless you have this foundation underneath, you will never understand, never be able to overcome violence against women. And the one word is sin. It's sin that shapes exploitative genders. It's sin that distorts relationships, that actually weaves its way into economics and politics and power. And actually, it damages relationships. Wherever you get sin, whether it's in cultures, whether it's in systems of belief or whatever it is, it will leave its impact. And it will leave its impact on all of these things, whether it's childhood, gender, politics, economics, power, human bodies, anything. It leaves its impact. And sin also shows itself, particularly, as far as I'm concerned, and the book I wrote, in the global oppression of the vulnerable. It's not just women, it's the vulnerable anywhere who will be globally oppressed, whether it's the poor, whether it's the disabled, whether it's children or whatever. Sin shows itself in the global oppression of the vulnerable, and especially in this case, in violence against women. So I'm pleading for a proper theology of sin, not just to go back to hellfire preaching, but to realize how sin weaves its way into our structures, our cultures, our minds, our thought patterns, and everything that we do, our laws, our legislation. Sin is alienating, cutting us off from each other, from God, from ourselves. Sin is destructive, tearing down what God has made us good. Sin can never build up. It can only ever tear down and destroy. Sin is delusory. We fool ourselves. It turns truth into lies, half-lies, complete lies, until we can't tell the truth or we can't recognize the truth anymore. And we believe our own propaganda. I'm sure many of you have been with people who got to that level where truth no longer matters in the way that they think, and you can't trust them at all. Sin is addictive. It gets inside our bodies like any kind of drug, and we become dependent on it. It becomes reinforced. It's self-generating. Sin actually produces its own energy, its own generative energy. It drives people. It forces them forward, and it's structural. It gets into structures, whether they're banking or policing or politics or whatever they are. It's there, and it actually leaves its impact, and it's generational. It goes down the generations, whether these are cultural generations, whether these are cultural patterns, or whether they're family generations. And I think a proper understanding of sin gives us a starting point for beginning to understand and engage with violence against women. Because sin doesn't ever need to have the last word. And this is where I want to get onto. Because really then it opens up the whole possibility of redemption, that we can do something about it. We can do something about it. I used to argue this the case when I was with the Open University. They used to really hate me going on about sin, and they'd say that was... The problem with Christians is so depressing. It's so depressing, you're always banging on about sin. And I said, no, it's a very, very optimistic process, a very optimistic concept. Think about it a minute, because we all agreed that there was an awful lot wrong with the world. These were people of good faith who really looked at the world and saw what was wrong with it. And I said, if you're saying that we as human beings, this is the very best we can produce, we're finished, completely finished. We're hopeless. But if my analysis is right, this is a product of sin. But there's always a possibility of redemption. We can do better. We can wipe the slate clean. We can receive forgiveness. We can start again. Sin ushers in a whole load of new possibilities. And therefore, it can speak. The love of God through Christ on the cross can speak into the lives of women and men and all of these other things I put here. Legal systems, economic structures, families, policing, neighborhoods, and so on. Because it's real. Because God's love is real, and it touches into our humanness at a different kind of level. What should we be doing as Christians? At the very least, this. Those of us who are Anglicans still say this most Sundays: let your light so shine before men and women that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. At the very least, we ought to be confessing the love of God in Jesus Christ and the fact that there is a redemptive possibility, a redemptive future. But we can do a lot of other things as well in this whole area. We can take the biblical understanding of male and female seriously. And I would really endorse so many of the things that people like Mary Evans have said in her wonderfully analytic, exegetical books about male and female. I think there's so much Christian literature now that we have no excuse for going around believing anything that isn't biblical about the nature of our human gendered lives. We can recognize God's compassion and feel our own guts being tugged at. And there's so many biblical calls to justice, whilst we're sitting very often just ignoring it all, ignoring the atrocities that are going on, not getting worked up. I was like this for most of my life until I actually saw it and experienced it and let myself be angry on behalf of the injustice that was happening to those who were vulnerable and to those who had no voice. Rereading the Hebrew scriptures, where you get an awful lot of violence against women, in the context in which that is happening, and recognize this isn't a blueprint, this actually has God's anger written across it, and reading those stories properly, learning from Jesus and women, and working globally for biblical truth in action. And I've got good news for you in that there's an awful lot of Christians doing precisely that, who right now are needing our support, whether they're running workshops in Africa or different parts of Haiti, whether they're running orphanages for people whose mothers have been violated and raped and then killed, whether they're actually mobilizing communities against rape. This is the Mothers' Union in Goma. They're not making jam. Nothing wrong with making jam. I make it every year. It's wonderful. But what they're doing is actually mobilizing schoolgirls, communities to protect schoolgirls against rape. Or Restored, an organization which is founded by Tearfund former international director, Peter Grant, who had seen so much of violence against women he couldn't continue without setting up an organization. And he's got a particular aspect for men in that organization, and it's called First Man Standing. And I would like to invite you to, if you're a man, to write to Peter and to actually be one of the first men standing alongside him. And you'll be called upon to do all kinds of things. Violence not in my name. My husband's an ambassador for that. Although there's one thing he won't do, he won't walk the mile in high heel shoes. He says it's not his scene. Beyond the Streets in Ipswich, tremendous organization just laboring away with prostitutes and sex workers, and knowing, as many other organizations do, and getting very little funding because it just isn't, it's not Christianly nice to be funding organizations like that, or Heal Africa. I want to finish with this picture because I love it so much. This is a soap-making factory in Baraka. All of these women have been violated. There are 3 male translators, and there's a man holding what looks like a thermometer. In fact, it's something to measure the acidity of the soap as it's bubbling up. And he was worried. He's an elder from a Baptist church, and he had heard that these women are looking for a livelihood, trying to trade with people to sell their soap, and his church was willing to buy the soap, but was very, very worried about the way that their hands were eaten away by the acid as they were testing the acidity. So he volunteered not just to buy the soap, but to test the acid, and his hands are now being eaten away, although they're more protected. When I was talking about why I was there, that I was a Christian, giving my own Christian testimony, assuring them that God actually loved them, that Jesus had an enormously high respect for women, telling the biblical stories, this woman in the red and white check said, "Oh, but I've met Jesus Christ." And I said, "Really?" She said, "Yes, he comes in every morning and tests the acidity of our soap."